In many ways, this is one of the more kind of surprising topics on our course, really, but it's also really fascinating. We are once again looking at the endocrine system, and I just want to remind you that we are referring today, and in previous tutorials, if you've watched, for example, my tutorial on hormones and glands, but we're talking about the endocrine system. Those being a series of glands capable of secreting the mediators that are hormones, these proteins, which once secreted from a gland can go and influence another part of the body. That's what we're talking about here. And we are specifically today talking about the reproductive hormones. Therefore, we're going to have quite a lot of focus on the gonads, okay? And the gonads being the collective term for the testes and the ovaries. Obviously, testes in males and ovaries in females. Okay, so that's what we're talking about today. Now, my big picture statement is the following. Okay, so I just want to get this picture across to you, and that is that reproductive hormones, if we think about these collectively, they have an impact. They have an impact. So reproductive hormones have an impact on overall health. Now, we're going to touch on numerous aspects of this today, but these reproductive hormones are important, but they also have an impact on, and therefore I'm going to put and, athletic performance. So we are not just talking about health today, we are also talking about movement quality and athletic performance. With that in mind, let's get straight into this. I want to introduce you, or quite probably remind you actually, you may well, in fact you probably did study this in your GCSE biology. I want to remind you of progesterone. Okay, now progesterone, first of all, is secreted in the gonads, obviously predominantly in females, in the ovaries. So it's produced in the ovaries, which we see here. So let me actually just put this down here, in the ovaries. And it's in particularly high levels. By the way, it's produced in the ovaries after ovulation. I've actually put that in there, after ovulation. But it is in particularly high levels in the first 10 weeks of pregnancy. So a pregnant female will have high progesterone levels in their system. And why is this relevant? Well, here I'm going to sort of click to my other colour. It has what's called a thermogenic effect. Now, what do we mean by a thermogenic? You probably already realise something to do with heat. It has a tendency to cause heat. Okay, that's what we mean by thermogenic. It sort of does what it says on the tin. And because of that, it can have a certain impact. It can, for example, influence sleep. Now, that isn't always positive, obviously, but it can influence sleep quality. But there are a series of studies, and I'll come to others here, that argue the following. So these are like the big wins, if you like, for progesterone. So let me put it into some kind of lovely green colour, back to this green here. The positives are as follows. It suggests that people get an increase in the presence of progesterone. They get an increase in oxidative metabolism. So if you consider that the aerobic system becomes more efficient, more impacting, that means that that means that we get an up arrow in aerobic performance. And what we mean by that specifically is that athletes who are doing moderate intensity, long duration activities, such as a triathlon, for example, they are able to work at higher intensities aerobically and delay that lactate inflection point that we look at in other tutorials and delay the onset of fatigue. Now, that is really, really impacting. However, other studies, which you might sort of see as the more skeptical approach, other studies say that there is no impact. And obviously you can read a little bit more and you can look at the balance of those. So some studies argue that increased oxidative metabolism, others argue that it's got no impact. Now, this here is a really, sorry, my phone's tingling in the background. This here is actually a really important statement because, and this is awful by the way, but there were numerous cases, and I'm not going to name countries, but if we go back to the 70s and 80s where there were enforced pregnancies and I'll rephrase that. There were young athletes, female athletes, were caused to become pregnant. I'm sure you know how that happens. And those pregnancies were the abortion of those pregnancies was forced after about 10 weeks so that the progesterone effect was of benefit to those athletes in that period of time. Now, I'm not going to say exactly where those accusations have been made. If you want to look into it, feel free and go and have a look at that, but you can see why perhaps it might have been relevant. Now, we're also, in this conversation, we're going to talk about estrogen. Now, with estrogen, I'm going to spell it in this format with the E after the O. Just bear in mind that sometimes you see it with only one vowel at the start. So just bear that in mind. So again, produced in the ovaries predominantly. Why is this stuff important? Well, these are some of the impacts of estrogen. It helps with insulin, or it helps insulin, and specifically, as we've seen before, to get glucose into cells. Okay, so estrogen, obviously much higher levels in women than in men, it can help get glucose into cells. Also, it is thought to have the following impact. It is thought to up arrow increase lipid utilization. Now, let me be clear what we mean by that. This means that athletes or people who are performing in sporting long duration performances, they can use fats, lipids, at higher intensity activity. Now, generally speaking, lipids are used for lower intensity. But of course, if you can use fats as your fuel source, your substrate for higher intensity, what does this mean? Is it leads to what we might call glycogen sparing. And that means that glycogen, which might be used at lower intensities than the situation we're describing here, will now be spared until much higher intensities. And therefore, it's called glycogen sparing. Now, a couple of negatives, so I'll go to our I haven't really got a red colour, see if I can get one here. So a couple of negatives, however, here we go. So we're saying that if we've got low estrogen, okay, so if levels are low, think about, for example, menopause in women. We'll come back to menopause in men in a second, but when we think about menopause in women, for example, this can lead to joint stiffness, okay? Joint stiffness can be an issue with absence, but this can also lead to another negative. Of course, the positives the other way around. This can lead to an up arrow, a greater chance of osteoarthritis. Okay, and this is not uncommon to occur in females experiencing menopause, for example. Now, the only thing I want to mention about estrogen further to that is there's actually numerous different types of estrogen. I'm not going to get into all 4 naturally produced types here. That's for another level and for another tutorial. What we are going to do is we're going to have a look at the concept, let me change colour, of testosterone. Now, I'm not prepared to make it blue, but because it would all become a bit boy-like somehow in the traditional sense, I suppose. But we're going to look at testosterone. Testosterone is produced 10 times as much in males than in females, and that is because the majority of it is produced in the testes, which of course only males have. So therefore, testosterone is far more common, far higher levels in males than females. What does it do? It has a role in bone formation. So it's really important from a bone formation perspective, coming back to sort of preventing osteoarthritis as well. What this also means is that men who are experiencing hypogonadism, let me spell that better than I just did, oh my word, James, goodness me, start that again, that was meant to be an A, believe it or not, hypogonadism, which is referred to as the male menopause, the underproduction of testosterone. Think about this male menopause. What occurs from this is that men have a higher chance in these situations of experiencing a fracture risk. Now, those of you that are cynical about a male menopause and thinking, well, that's a load of meh, I just want to state, and I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of this, I personally have been diagnosed with that condition, and not unrecently, it was actually this year. And what it means in my case is that my testosterone production levels are falling too rapidly in one particular type of testosterone, and that is causing me to experience more fatigue than I should experience, and a couple of other health issues as well. And it's called hypogonadism, nothing to be ashamed about. Male menopause, just in case you thought it was a load of rubbish, it actually exists, at least as an umbrella term. So, other things on the positives, guys. Let's go to the positives. What does this stuff do? Testosterone is really good for protein synthesis. That means that muscle tissue growth, for example, is really useful. But it also means that we need greater numbers of amino acids. In other words, more protein is required in the diet. So we've also, therefore, we can say we get possibly one positive is a greater production of muscle tissue. Now, this has to be in combination with training, but athletes with high levels of testosterone may be able to develop more muscle tissue, really good for power and speed. But the other things that this is good for is the utilization. I'll write it down, see if you know what I mean by this. The utilization of Fe. Fe, of course, the chemical symbol for iron. That's actually really important because that, of course, goes to the building of hemoglobin, and that influences the oxygen carrying capacity of the body. Therefore, the higher the levels of testosterone, perhaps the greater the production of hemoglobin through the utilization of Fe iron. I think that's all from me. Cheers.